afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and we're going to be looking at a good variety of news stories this week. So I'm joined by my colleagues, both Peter Wright and Sharon Barno. I will pass over to Peter and then Sharon to introduce themselves, and then we will get started.
Thank you, Amelia. So my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor. I'm managing director at Digital Law, and looking forward to talking to our listeners and viewers this week about some quite big, hefty stories that have been out there in both the sort of the weekend Sunday papers and also a few other things that have been brewing. So I'll pass back to you, Amelia, to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So, kind of starting with a bang here, I think you'd have to be living under a rock at this stage if you've not heard that Twitter has kind of been headlining the news most days. They are the gift that keeps on giving. So we've kind of got a variety of points that we're going to be discussing in relation to Twitter today. But as an overview, we'll be looking at the dismissal of mass employees worldwide, and then to add insult to injury, them asking sacked staff to return to work. Paying for the blue tick and the parody accounts. So I will pass over to Peter and Sharon to discuss this in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Amelia. So yes, lots of things happening at Twitter since Elon Musk walked into their reception with a large sink only 2 weeks ago now, but it seems a lot has happened in that time. Indeed, one of the things is they've announced that the blue tick is going and you'll have to pay $8 for it rather than getting it for free, which has led to an awful lot of people saying, well, this will raise issues over security. They've said, oh, we've had this verified so that we don't suffer from online abuse, etc. So there have been various politicians and leaders complaining about that. There has been an exodus of users, apparently, certainly celebrity users from the platform, many of whom engaged in parodying activity. So they ended up changing their profiles to say they were actually Elon Musk, doing and saying various things. And then an edict came around saying, well, we are going to remove parody accounts or those impersonating others, unless it is made very clear that they are just a normal satirical parody. So that has led to certainly a few high-profile users departing. But in the meantime, Elon Musk, who's now the self-styled, and it's his own words on his own profile, it says Chief Twit, he circulated a graph this week saying that apparently the user numbers on Twitter are through the roof, and they've now just passed the 250 million barrier. Still a lot smaller than a platform like, say, Facebook, with its 3.6 billion users. But of course, exchanges on Twitter are very, very different. So certainly a lot has been happening. And Chirono, I know that you've been following these events as well.
Yes, I have. And the recent layoffs regarding the Twitter staff en masse have been incredibly concerning. I really feel for quite a lot of people who have lost their jobs because he's planning on sacking about 25% of the global workforce, which is a concern because some of that workforce will be the content moderation teams. And with the increase of online hate speech and just the conflation of all these sorts of extremist point of views, it's just concerning what will happen, especially with a platform like Twitter, which is the quote unquote town square, the global town square, where people come and voice their opinions. And it's unfortunate because we live in a world where the most extreme voices are often the loudest, and if we lose quite a big part of that workforce that contribute to moderating these sorts of hate speech, what's going to happen? What will Twitter be like? So yeah, it's incredibly concerning from that standpoint. And I worry what the impact that's going to have on politics, especially in the long term, and this incredibly turbulent period we are in politically, not just in the United Kingdom, but in the US as well, and other countries across the world.
Well, it's interesting that the move to start charging for the blue tick has been specifically delayed until after the US midterm elections. So voting is taking place on the 8th of November, but they're saying that the introduction of charging the blue tick will now not start until after those elections have passed. And I think that was likewise for reasons of security, freedom of speech, discourse, etc. There was a fear that would that it wouldn't be good to have that happening in the days leading up to or on the day of the election itself.
Absolutely, and it's quite, sorry.
Go on.
Oh, I was just going to say it's quite unfortunate as well, especially given that you've got this complete and total I guess domination of Twitter when it comes to things like journalism and news and the impact it can have on politics and the trajectory of governments. We saw that with the Trump government, and we've seen that the way that Twitter will impact often politics in such large ways. So to see now I don't know, it's quite concerning in my view, the way Twitter now being run by.
You're absolutely right. And so it's almost like it has a disproportionate impact on political and public discourse, given the number of journalism articles, journalists that use Twitter as a basis for their articles. A number of times you flick through a story online and it's based on a couple of tweets that have been embedded and are used as a factual source and point of reference in a way that you don't get with any other network, including Facebook. Really, you get tweets embedded in a way that you don't get embedded with Facebook posts. And it's because of the nature of the users on there. It's the fact that you've got media personalities, celebrities, politicians, leaders all on there, able to speak to each other and interact with each other. That means that it's quite a unique ecosystem in that regard, even though it's only got this quarter of a billion users compared to the multiple billions of Facebook. But I think also, Sharona, when it comes to the redundancy, well, we would call them redundancies in the UK. In the US, it's just you're fired. And it seems that Elon Musk was of the view he was actually sort of bending over backwards by giving them 3 months of you got 3 months salary when you were fired as well. It's just like, look, we're giving you more than the law in the US actually requires. But it's interesting that he may have fallen foul of employment law and employment regulations. Certainly in the UK, statutory consultation period wasn't observed. And indeed, it depends if they've actually complied with redundancy law insofar as, those who've been there for a number of years, have they received the statutory minimum? Because it'd be an awfully tight of a tech firm to stick to the statutory minimum in the UK. You'd expect a bit more than that, to put it bluntly. Not to mention the more established employment law that is in the case across the EU, as well as in some other jurisdictions. Not to mention, as well, that on the day that Musk took over Twitter, he also fired the CEO, various other executive officers, and the board in fairly short order. And there was talk that certainly the CEO and others were entitled to severance packages of tens of millions of dollars. But it's subsequently come out that he's saying, I've actually fired these people for cause. In theory, I think meaning that he then won't have to make those payments. But I think it wouldn't surprise me if we end up with litigation on the fact that people have been fired in a way that doesn't comply with the law. And indeed, some of those high-profile individuals, those big earners, there's probably going to be litigation and then a settlement with regards to those payments and whether they were or were not paid.
100%. And in fact, I know that the Workers' Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, so that's the federal act in the United States regarding employment law and sackings and layoffs. So the act requires employers give a 60 days notice before initiating mass layoffs. And I've read already that there is one staff in San Francisco who is going to be bringing forward a suit. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. But I will say that I feel for Twitter's legal team, or whoever's left in the legal team as of now, because they're going to have a lot of work on their hands.
Yes, I think another one of the people that was fired was certainly the legal counsel and in-house legal team seemed to have been laid off in fairly short order as well. And he, regardless of the opinion on their abilities, the fact is we've got people here who have been embedded with the organization and know how it works. And for example, in digital law, we are very skilled in knowing how the law relating to technology works. It's a very small Venn diagram of those who know about the law and the technology and can apply it. And of those specialists, they've just got rid of a load who actually knew how their system and the organization operated. So they will not be particularly easy to replace.
100%, and it explains why they're asking people to come back so soon after sacking them. It's so unfortunate, and that actually, rightly, like as you said, Pete, it's going to be incredibly difficult for Elon to justify some of the layoffs. I actually listened to a podcast. I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. I listened to a podcast the other day that was talking about how they went about laying off some of the staff. So they actually had some of the staff come in, and they said, bring in your last 30 days of work and show evidence of all the code you've written in the last 30 days. And it just seemed like they were sacking people off depending on how much work they've done within a very small period of time. I don't know if that's a great way to justify hiring people, because, you know, what does that say exactly? And how will that play out in the courts? Will they see that as fair? Anyway, it remains to be seen, but this is definitely a developing story that we will be keeping an eye on.
It is, and I think a final point, just to wrap up there, is that's a very good point with regards to the coding and what they may or may not have been asked to do, because apparently, of course, at the same time as instituting all these layoffs, new code and new systems are having to be built to be able to cope with charging for the blue tick. So that has to be built, and apparently the teams responsible for that were working day and night to try and get it done, and then some of the people who were working on it were then fired. This is almost up there with Vladimir Putin and his mobilization of people taking away key people from the Russian economy and sending them to the front. It's right up there with that. You know, in this instance, it's getting rid of the people that you need to be able to help you with running the organization and to do the changes that you've already asked for, that you want done in double quick time. But also the fact that actually it's turning out that you can institute such a radical change comparatively quickly is also having ramifications across the tech industry as well, because some things that otherwise you might have said, oh, these would take weeks or months to do, if you're then saying, well, actually, that in reality, if we throw resources at it, it can be done quickly. That's a problem for some of the other big tech firms, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, who are looking to comply with legislation like the EU's Digital Markets Act, who would have probably been looking to say, look, it will take us years to comply with some of these things, so we'll do some things now and some things further down the line because it will be so expensive, difficult to do, etc., etc., etc. Whereas then if you get Twitter say, well, actually, we're going to introduce radical changes quickly, it kind of takes the wind out of their sails. And that's something that regulators may look at when they're then investigating how some of the platforms operate under legislation like the DMA, which demands an awful lot of tech platforms to show that they are being open and transparent in terms of how they're operating, and demanding certain changes in terms of how they operate. So the leeway for tech firms to be able to dodge enforcement may be somewhat limited by the example that Twitter ends up showing now, but that's probably a story for another podcast, and we spent long enough talking about Twitter just now as it is.
Thanks, Peter. So this leads us quite nicely onto Meta laying off workers. So layoffs are expected to affect thousands of employees, with an announcement planned kind of later this week. So in October, Meta predicted a weak quarter and significantly more costs next year, wiping around $67 billion of its stock market value. So this disappointing outlook comes as Meta is contending with slowing global economic growth and competition from other tech companies as well, such as kind of TikTok and privacy changes from Apple, as well as concerns about the company's spending in threat of regulation. So leading on nicely from what you were just saying there, Peter. So yet another tech company that is going to have a massive effect on workers. So I'll pass over to you to discuss this.
Yeah, thank you, Amelia. So, I mean, it's interesting the challenges that Facebook is facing on a multitude of different fronts. For the first time ever, it has a falling number of regular monthly users, first time in its history since 2007. It's always been a growth story in terms of adding users on in the intervening period. And they're also facing competition because of the tools that they have are no longer as powerful as they were. Those who are buying and setting up new iPhones will be familiar with the fact that the new versions of Apple's iOS ask, are you comfortable with information being shared from your phone? And if you are not, that actually cuts off a lot of the information gathering and sharing that the Facebook app up until now was able to do. So an awful lot of the information that would then use for its targeted advertising, where it makes a lot of its money, would come from taking data off your handset squirreling that away and using it for the purposes of then being able to power the targeted advertising systems that Facebook has. It is estimated that having lost that function, it is depriving Facebook of revenues of $10 billion per year in the US alone. So you can extrapolate from there the impact it's going to have year on year on their business. That's before we then go into some of the other issues. And as you say, Amelia, the competition which they're facing from TikTok. Facebook and Instagram simply are not bringing in enough new, younger users. There's still plenty of old people on there like me who continue to share tedious information, but we're very often sharing it in the terms of posts and photos, which is what we've been doing for the last 15 years, whereas apparently young people like to share videos and things instead. And as a result, it's meaning that TikTok is more popular. When they attempted to reform and bring in more video on Instagram, people hated it. TikTok is almost like sort of TV on steroids in terms of you being able to search and watch what you want, when you want, how you want. And Facebook simply has no argument to that, and is indeed struggling consequently to bring in new young users. There's still plenty of old users, hundreds of millions of them, but the point is that new ones aren't being attracted. So they have what they've got and they remain quite useful and valuable, but they ain't going to be replenishing them. So ultimately the platform's influence will diminish as a result.
Absolutely, and it could just be the case of the life cycle of a company, of an industry. The same way MySpace was one of the biggest platforms in the social media space ages and ages and ages ago, the prehistoric era. Facebook has now become this unfortunately very archaic an organization that isn't necessarily viewed by the younger generation as more culturally relevant. And whereas you have companies like Twitter, which is again relevant for political, cultural reasons, and then you've got the rise of TikTok, which is just so addictive. They have basically cracked the code with Gen Z, and its addictive algorithm is so hard to run away from. And unfortunately, it's just proven very difficult for Facebook and Meta to replicate with Instagram, and subsequently with Facebook and all the issues it's had and all the I forget the word, controversies it's had with the 2016 elections and subsequent data protection breaches and whatnot. It's going to be proven very difficult for Meta to see what happens to Meta moving forward as a company. But I think the shift to the metaverse may prove to be a useful potential, I guess, alternative income source. But again, that depends on how many people are using Facebook still.
Well, that's a really good point, Sharona, but I think they're sort of almost betting the house on the metaverse being the future. Apparently that's where Mark Zuckerberg's spending all his time, and all of his energies is on the metaverse. He's not seeing Facebook as being the future. I think the problem, though, is that there are only a very small number of users globally who have, £1,500 to be able to go and spend on a VR headset to go and spend any time in there. And then even if you've got the hardware, do you actually want to go into the metaverse and what Meta are offering? Interestingly, they are pouring huge R&D resources into building the metaverse, though they are not attracting users in there. Even, I think this is quite an important point, even the people who are currently employed building it do not spend any time in their personal time in there using it. So it's almost like if you're building something that doesn't attract you to go and use it, how do we expect other people to go and spend time in it? I almost wonder if this is a bit like the dot-com boom of 20 years ago, where everyone could see that the future would be digital technology. It's just that there was a big bubble of speculation because people thought, yes, this is the future, but there simply wasn't the footfall and the usage to justify the speculation. In this instance, yeah, it could be that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, that the metaverse is the future. But right now, in 2022, it simply isn't. And can Meta survive putting the resources in that it is and wait for people to start coming in the sort of critical mass volumes? Or does it potentially become the white elephant? Is it like Google Glass, which everyone was saying to us about 5-6 years ago would be the future? Then it turned out that people didn't want to walk around with a big frame on the front of their face.
Absolutely, exactly. Well, it remains to be seen what's going to happen with with Meta. But I will say, the layoffs with both Twitter and Meta, I hope they're not setting a trend in the next year when it comes to layoffs and what companies are going to be doing with their employees. It's really unfortunate, very, very scary. So I'm really, really sympathetic to everybody in the tech industry right now.
Indeed, and I think it's a point that for the whole global economy, I think we have to look at the headwinds at the moment and sort of be quite wary of what could happen in the next 12 to 18 months. But that's a concern across the whole world, across the global economy. So let's hope that these layoffs aren't a harbinger of a lot worse to come.
So kind of moving on from there and considering what the tech world is going to be looking like in the next couple of months, that segues us very nicely into the online safety bill changes. So we've spoken a lot on this podcast about the proposed online safety bill. However, they're specifically looking at changing the legal but harmful decision. So the initial bill essentially meant that the government could ban anything that they deemed harmful. However, this is looking to be removed because if you think about it, essentially limits free speech to a certain extent. But what this change might look like and how watered down it gets kind of remains to be seen. So I'll pass over to Peter and Sharono to go through this in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Amelia. So we have talked a little bit about this before, but basically this refers to the UK's online safety bill, which is soon to be published. But there was a concern over some of the wording in the last version that was published that referred to something called legal but harmful, i.e. the idea that you could have content that passed the letter of the law but could still be deemed by the authorities to be harmful and therefore worthy of being sanctioned or removed. Whenever this was raised by newspapers, publishers, the media with the government, they would say, no, this is no need to worry. This is just going to be in there, but this won't have an impact on publishing news stories. It won't have an impact on freedom of speech. Your concerns are totally baseless. There's nothing to worry about. But they did make it clear, Nadine Dorries, the culture secretary who was responsible for this bill coming through, did suggest that, for example, some of the jokes that Jimmy Carr makes could qualify as being legal but harmful. Now, he is one of many comedians that push things close to the bone. It's not going to be for everyone. Some people might be upset by what he says, but it's almost like you might not agree with what he says, but he should probably still have the right to say it, given that he is a comedian and that's the way this operates. But this is where we then start coming into the area of, well, what should or shouldn't be allowed when it comes to content online. Now, just to give you an example, the concerns here were starting to grow. David Davies, who is a member of Parliament, made a speech against the principle of vaccine passports, and that ended up being removed by YouTube. He was saying this was the start of basically a virus-secure state and would have been, hence he didn't agree with it, given that he's made big policy points on civil liberties before. The Socialist Workers page was removed by Facebook. So other political pages could be removed. Novara Media's YouTube page was taken down. The epidemiologist Professor Carl Hennigan and Tom Jefferson's analysis of face mask data was labelled false information by Facebook, when it was merely just scientists saying, well, we don't necessarily agree with one scientific school of thought, and here is another. It's almost like we've seen examples of censorship that could therefore become quite worrying, and it was based on these sorts of things. Not to mention, for example, platforms like PayPal, who've been going around and saying that certain groups, for example, the Free Speech Union, they closed the bank account of the Free Speech Union saying, well, what you're doing violates our terms of service. Yet they've been offering those services up until that point without a problem, and then seem to decide that that it shouldn't be provided. And the point here is that at least now in this legislation, it will not hopefully contain that legal but harmful section. And there was a real fear that it could have lent to a chilling effect in terms of what could or could not be said online, with government censorship becoming involved in an area where frankly, you'd have thought that the government doesn't have the resources to be able to spend on that level of censorship.
100%. It's so concerning. And actually, there were quite a few commentators who were worried at worst case scenario of this almost like China-like censorship power the government would have. And, it may not be the case that this government decides to be authoritarian and say, certain things can't be said and whatnot. But it very well could be that another government does. And especially now with such moving and changing premierships we've been having, short-term premierships in the UK, it's concerning. And I'm glad that this has been thrown out, and it's definitely a step in the right direction. But I think it is again concerning what's going to happen now, because this online safety bill just seems to, it just never seems to be able to get out of the the docket. It's just constantly getting revised and revised. So and the pivot.
It is, but at least this, Gerald, at least this particularly contentious thing having been removed, hopefully means there is now going to be sufficient support to get something through, because I think there is a need for greater safety online, and we've seen enough examples of problematic content on some platforms like Facebook that have been linked with self-harm, suicide, etc. I think there is an urgent need to make sure that people are protected from content like that, but it's coming down to the sort of quibbling issues here over sort of freedom of speech that arguably government has no place in being involved. And that's a really good point as well you make about it. Well, it's all well and good for the current government or current ministers to say, well, we wouldn't use it like that. It's perfectly fine. We wouldn't be draconian and take down, investigative journalism, for example. But the point is that just because one government says that, who knows what might be elected 5, 10, 15 years down the line, and how they may seek to then apply and enforce laws that are already on the statute book and use them for their own ends. So that's why it's so important with this stuff, that you can't necessarily just sit there and rely on assurances that might be given. It's more a matter of, well, what's actually on the face of the act that is the most crucial thing. And if the thing on the face of the act contains these potential powers, that's where we've got to make sure that it is either amended or removed so it is not misused in the future.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story, kind of sticking with the theme of government here. So the UK Information Commissioner has agreed to reduce the £500,000 monetary penalty notice imposed on the Cabinet Office in 2021 in relation to the New Year Honours data breach to £50,000, which the Cabinet Office has agreed to pay. So our keen listeners may remember that we mentioned this story in depth last year in around December, where we looked at how the names of the honour list had been put online, and some of the unredacted addresses could also be accessed. So this personal data was available online for a period of around 2 hours and 21 minutes and was accessed 3,872 times. So we can see here that there has been quite a massive reduction from the £500,000 to just 50,000. So I'll pass over to Peter to go through this.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, it's just so interesting because, first of all, this story tells us a number of things in terms of how data protection regulation works. First of all, it's taken approximately a year from in terms of the investigation, it took approximately a year for this to be investigated and a fine to be applied. And then, of course, it's now been reduced as well from £500,000 down to 50,000. There's a bit of a pattern there, because don't forget that British Airways was originally subject to a multi-million-pound fine of over £100 million. It was reduced down to £20 million because of the pandemic and the fact that airlines were at risk during those early months of the pandemic. Similar thing for Marriott Hotels, who were fined 100 million. That was reduced to around 20 odd million as well for massive data protection breach. Yet it ended up being reduced because of the pandemic. The Cabinet Office can't point to the pandemic as an excuse. Unfortunately it's their own incompetence, to put it bluntly, that is the problem here. And the thing is as well, you don't just think, oh, this is only the privileged elite that would have received honours. Very often honours are given to those who have displayed a lifetime of public service, either in the military or in education, healthcare. And indeed, not necessarily, sometimes it's the people who've been engaged in, for example, manning street crossings for children and things like that have ended up being recognised with a CBE or an OBE or a knighthood. So this isn't just for sort of political appointees or people that help the government. That's why it is 1,000 people. The majority of those people will be perfectly normal people who then had their information available online and then had it accessed for almost 4,000 times. So this is an egregious breach, and it's not at all not at all on. And I think it's surprising, unfortunately, that the fine has been reduced on this stage, and almost suggests that therefore future egregious breaches by the Cabinet Office won't be necessarily particularly heavily fined either. So perhaps it just reflects the way that the ISO wishes to work with the public sector in future.
Thanks, Peter. So our next story as well is looking at a main focus on the government sector. So this is in relation to the Department of Education. So the ICO has issued a reprimand to the Department for Education following the prolonged misuse of personal information of up to 28 million children. Yes, you did hear that right, 28 million children. So the investigation found that poor due diligence meant a database of people's learning records were ultimately used by Trust Systems Software UK, an employment screening firm, to check whether people opening online gambling accounts were in fact 18. And it found that the Department of Education has overall responsibility for the learning records database, which provides a record of the pupils' qualifications and the education providers can access. So this is a big red flag here. I mean, there's such a huge amount of children that may well have been affected, and not to mention the fact that it was looking at opening gambling accounts, which seems, you mix children and gambling in the same sentence, doesn't quite sit right. I don't know about you, Peter.
Indeed, I think what really needs to be looked at here are the processes that led to the Department for Education providing access to the learning records database, learning records service database, which provides a record of each pupil's qualifications so that education providers can access it. They need to explain exactly how and why that database ended up being provided to a company called Trustopia, who were more interested in trying to find out whether people opening online gaming accounts really were 18 or not. So the point here is information was provided for a purpose, and that was for the purpose of education providers being able to access it, and instead it was used for an entirely different purpose. I mean, it wasn't essential there for Trustopia to be able to see someone's GCSE results or the dates when they were hoping to do their A-levels. All they were looking for was names, email addresses, and dates of birth, so they didn't have to see all of the associated education and skills information that would have been in that database. But even then, that information was not provided by the users for that purpose. So this seems to have just been a request that was made and has eventually been processed and permitted through the DFE, Department for Education. And there seems to have been no real good controls in place where anyone stopped and thought, oh, actually, should we be releasing all of this personal data? So there's two shocking things at the end of this. One is the fact that it's the personal information of 28 million children, minors below the age of 13, as they're defined in the UK, are children. And that's the information that seems to have been shared. And then there's the fact that, we aren't even giving out an enforcement or a monetary penalty notice. It's just a reprimand. So I'm sure it won't happen again.
Thanks, Peter. I think as well, it's the fact that it was a reprimand setting out clear measures that they need to action to improve their data protection practices so children's data is properly looked after. I mean, that's so much less than even a slap on the wrist. Like, at least, the Cabinet Office for that data breach, which was largely unrelated to adults and just the kind of addresses, they received £50,000 monetary penalty notice in the end, which is going to be paid. And yet here, Department of Education, who has made 28 million children kind of misuse of personal data. It doesn't quite seem balanced, really, does it?
It does not, and all we can hope is that the ICO has made these recommendations for what the Department for Education should do to improve its processes. I hope they check back in after 6 months or 12 months and make sure that something has been done. I suspect the answer will be precious little will be practically done. There may be a few impressive looking documents that are rolled out that say we're going to do this, that and the other. But what it actually needs is for proper in-depth assessment whereby the ICO go in and actually find more what happens in terms of what you do with different requests and look at, for example, what requests have then been made and granted over the subsequent 12 months and see if there's been actually any meaningful difference or not. That's what would need to happen. And I hope it does. And I hope that if they find out that information like that is still being distributed without a care in the world, that something is done about it more than a reprimand, and that actually they use the big stick that they've been given by the legislation, and they use the enforcement powers that they've got.
Thanks, Peter. No doubt we'll be revisiting this story in the coming months, especially considering the size. However, moving to our last story of the day, we are looking at the global hacking network. So private investigators linked to the City of London are using an India-based computer hacking gang to target British businesses, government officials and journalists. So the Sunday Times and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism have been given access to the gang's database, which reveals extraordinary scales of the attacks. It shows that criminals targeted the private email accounts of more than 100 victims on behalf of investigators working for autocratic states, British lawyers and their wealthy clients. So just to name a few people that have been targeted, you've got Philip Hammond, the then Chancellor. He was hacked when he was dealing with the fallout of Russia's Novikov poisonings in Salisbury. We have got hackers breaking into the email inboxes of Formula One motor racing bosses Ruth Buscombe and Alfa Romeo team Otmar, apologies for the pronunciation there.
Safnauer.
Otmar Safnauer, thanks Peter, who was a chief executive of Aston Martin team. And then we've got a variety of other people as well, including the gang's order to target BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, in May, 3 weeks after his appointment was announced. So as you can see here, there's a range of victims that have been targeted for different reasons. However, this is quite a terrible thing to see, because not only have we got this story, but only a few weeks ago we were talking about how you could essentially buy Liz Truss's ex-Prime Minister's phone number for about £6 on the black market. So really we need to consider that these high-profile figures need to be overhauling their cybersecurity and making sure that the more simple things such as email address, passwords are being cracked down on. So I will pass over to Peter to go through this.
Thank you, Amelia. I mean, this is a really worrying story. I think sometimes there has been a temptation within government to think we have the National Cybersecurity Centre and we've developed these offensive cybersecurity capabilities in terms of potential cyber warfare. Therefore, the UK is in the lead compared to other countries. And this is showing that is categorically not the case. We are just as vulnerable as anyone else, it turns out, in terms of the fact that we've had senior ministers of state, Prime Minister and Chancellor having their phones hacked, senior people in the media targeted with impunity. And they need to think about that when, for example, any confidential source thinking, oh, I'll go along and speak to the political editor of the BBC, is probably going to think twice, because they'll think, oh, actually, who else is going to be listening to this? Is it just the BBC political editor, or will it be someone in Moscow or someone in China who's also able to hear this? And it becomes a real concern as a result. It means that, for example, whistleblowers may be less ready to come forward. It may mean that certain business and transactions has to take place face to face rather than using phones, video conferencing, etc., because of the risk of potentially being hacked. It means that people need to be even more mindful of issues around confidentiality, commercial sensitivity and personal data when they are exchanging information online. And they also need to be alive to the fact that this sort of targeting takes place. The fact is that it's clear that a London law firm that was acting for a body that turned out to be the Russian state was then turning around and saying to a private investigator, we need to get hold of information related to a specific individual. And the private investigator then went off and commissioned hacking and made payments to the hackers of thousands of pounds in return for the services that they provided. So the fact that a lot of this seems to be being commissioned from within the UK and the City of London is a concern. It suggests that some of the rules that we've got in place around payments and ethics, not to mention the fact of money being paid for the the commissioning of what is a crime. Don't forget that hacking is a crime, fraud is a crime. Therefore, it shouldn't be being facilitated by institutions and organisations based in the City of London. This, of course, is a story that's just been splashed on the Sunday Times as of this weekend. They've now provided all the evidence in terms of what they've got. Who's going to actually pick it up and do something about it? I remain convinced that if any political party turned around and said, we're really going to start doing something around cyber fraud, hacking, and stopping you, the individual, being the victim of fraud and online hacking, let alone potentially doing something to stop this sort of targeting taking place, I think you'd win a landslide. But at the moment, no political party really understands it or is doing anything about it from a policy perspective.
Absolutely. And I'll also just say that cybersecurity concerns have been one of the main points of concern for CEOs and global leaders across the world for quite a long time. If you read some of the reports that were being released by companies, you know, looking ahead of 2020 and the new decade, what are going to be the main concerns? Cybersecurity was at the forefront, in addition to other things like climate change and subsequently COVID-19. So it's not shocking that an attack of this scale has occurred, and the fact that this went on for about 7 years. This person the person who was running this network of this gang, it was running for 7 years, and I mean they were also using phishing techniques in order to carry out some of their hacks. So it makes me think that some of the governments that were implicated in some of the organizations that were targeted, they might need to rerun their cybersecurity training a little bit, just so they can remind everyone, you know, everything that needs to be done to avoid these sorts of attacks, because it's something that can be stopped quite easily if you know what to look out for and you know what to be wary of. And yeah, it's unfortunate, but cyber espionage and cyber warfare is unfortunately not new, and unfortunately it's just a new reality of the world that we live in and the current landscape. And the use of these ATPs, these advanced persistent threats, and hacker groups to run agendas and to fulfill, you know, the needs of governments or organizations in search of information or whatever it is they're seeking. It's nothing new. It's what's been happening for years now. So it's unfortunate that we're having government ministers falling victim to it, and it's quite concerning for the security of this country and for the security of other nations as well.
I think
It is, and you make. So I was just going to say, Girona, you make a very good point there with regards to phishing attacks, and really you'd think that people would be able to spot these, and it doesn't require training at too much of a high end to be able to usually spot that, not just on email, but in terms of other forms of instant messaging, SMS, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp. You should be able to really, in all seriousness, be able to usually identify what could be a potentially fraudulent phishing attack. But it looks like phishing was the main vector that was used in order to carry out the majority of these attacks. And it's interesting that, of course, the statistic has come out this week that the companies in the UK spend half of what companies in Europe spend, or indeed companies, I think, across the G7 ordinarily spend when it comes to training of their employees. And of course, one of those things should be regular awareness with regards to cybersecurity. But there seems to be a bit of a problem, certainly within the public and private sector in the UK, that when it comes to cybersecurity, training might be provided. Very often it's being delivered by the cheapest possible provider or the cheapest possible platform. It's dull, tedious, boring. Someone just clicks through it so they can then get through it, not really listen to the points being made or take the advice and guidance and apply it to their role. And then consequently, we have a whole generation of people who appear to be unable to spot fairly rudimentary phishing attacks when they're coming through. And these are the consequences now, where you've got clearly people at quite high-end roles who cannot identify these sorts of threats and therefore are falling victim to them. And you're quite right, Joanna. It therefore paints a very difficult picture when it comes to the wider security of business, commerce, and government and security as a whole across the UK.
Absolutely. And I wonder what the fallout is going to be regarding cybercrime and law enforcement. What's going to happen to companies that seek out these sort of hack for hire organizations, even if, because the company that was implicated, rather the gang that was implicated, was based in India, but the private investigators hiring them were British based. And in fact, one of the people involved in the gang in India said that British organizations have been hiring, and the whole world, in fact, are using Indian hackers and the use of Indian underworld to break into email accounts and smartphones, and all those practices have been proliferating for years. So it's concerning what's going to happen when it comes to law enforcement, and how exactly are the police and the cybercrime enforcement planning on cracking down on the sorts of hiring criminals essentially to do this. I wonder what's going to happen. What the fallout will be, and how swift it
Indeed.
will be as well.
And I remember, Chirona, you and I a year ago sat down and watched a demonstration of what it was possible to procure on the dark web. And I'm sure that it's now 10 times worse than it was then. But the point is that, yes, it is incredibly easy to commission this sort of work, to be able to find the best hackers in the world in India and other countries, and commission them to then be set free to go and undertake whatever they have been bidden. And this then leads to the problem where we are. It's going to take a lot of very careful thought by the National Cybersecurity Centre and by the security services, MI5, MI6, to think about a response to this. And I'm sure it's not going to be a particularly, I would hope it's not going to be a quick process, but it's not going to be cheap either. And at a time when budgets across the UK government are going to be severely tested due to the issues around 14% inflation and the cost of living, I'm afraid things like this are going to require funding. So it comes to having better security across government, better provision of advice and guidance from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, better clear rules that certainly are permeated across the public sector and followed and enforced across the public sector, to try and reduce some of this risk. It's then going to take buy-in from the private sector to simply ensure that standards are raised and then maintained, and not raised and then quickly forgotten again. And it also takes, for example, that the Metropolitan Police, when they receive tip-offs about this sort of activity, that they act on it and don't actually choose not to take action, as happened apparently when they were tipped off about these allegations, in particular about hacking in relation to individuals involved in the World Cup in Qatar. They were tipped off in October last year, but chose to take no action. And that simply is not going to be good enough anymore.
Absolutely. And I think the final thing I will say to this is just a little funny tidbit that was absolutely shocking to me, was how brazen this whole thing was. Apparently one of the people implicated was advertising on his LinkedIn networking page that, one of his skills was listed as Android hacking, mobile phone monitoring, email tracing. So you can see it was all out there.
Well, it's good to know that LinkedIn's good for something, and thank you, Chirona, for being able to find something. So at least we can finish our podcast this week with us on a slightly more positive note. So, and thank you very much for joining us and for your comments today. It's been great having you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Sharon. So that was, in fact, our last story of today. A big thank you again to Anson Evaluate and Sharon for joining us on this podcast, and we will hopefully be back next week. Just a reminder as well, you can access these podcasts via our YouTube channel and other podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and any other sort of podcast channel that you think you can find us on.